Good morning, everyone. My name is Gary Huntley, and I'm happy to host episode 6 of our State of Vegetation Management. Today, our webinar will be focused on regulators and utilities, and the title is Driving Savings, Safety, and Satisfaction for Ratepayers Through Technology-Enabled Vegetation Management. As I mentioned, this is episode 6, and our previous 5 episodes really focused on folks who actually worked in the utility businesses and they actually managed vegetation. So we had folks that came in and talked about their own personal experiences literally across the United States. And so we've had people talk about wildfires, we've talked about storms, we've talked about the technology, we've talked about some of the challenges that they faced with inflation and just a lot of the other challenges around trying to manage vegetation to keep the lights on. So today we have just a little bit of a different perspective. Again, I'll just mention a little bit about myself. So I'm Gary Huntley. I have over 3 decades of experience in energy. And the last 2 decades of that was actually in the electric utility. I worked for Entergy Corporation. I retired as Vice President of Distribution Services. And I'm happy to have with me today another panelist, Mr. Larry Kahn. Larry is the Distinguished Research Fellow from Tulane University Law School. Larry, would you tell us a little bit more about your background?
Sure. Thank you, Gary, and good morning, everyone. My background, I like to say that over the last 30 or so years, I've been going back and forth between seas and trees, and here we are at trees. And in connection with doing work together with the green industry and utilities, it became clear that uh, the entire industry needed a neutral academic forum where research could be done and where attorneys who can assist this industry can be trained. And so, with that, I helped to create the Tulane University Law School Utility Vegetation Management Institute. The program is about 3 years old. I'm currently the director of that program, and we seek to be that neutral third party that can assist regulators, the utility industry, tree companies, and the public at large with science-based recommendations on best laws, regulations, policies, and practices. Uh, and so I've held this position for the last 3 years, and I'm really enjoying it. The students who I've taken in have gone on to do everything from work directly for utility commissions to private law firms that are assisting in the energy and environment areas.
Thank you, Larry. And I think it's pretty interesting the sort of the space you occupy, right? Because in a lot of the regulatory proceedings, clearly you have the utilities that have their view about the investments that they need to make, the customer service, that they want for their ratepayers. You have regulators who also have their view, and a lot of times those things do overlap, but sometimes they don't necessarily overlap smoothly. And then you have third-party interests who come in, and while their interests could be, a little more narrow, I would say, but certainly at some point where they all sort of overlap, the customer usually benefits, right? And to the extent that you can get all those parties I named to align, which is not an easy task all the times, right? And so I think you come in with a very unique, non-biased, non-political perspective that sort of helps us to do that. So with that in mind, tell us, what are you seeing? I mean, you've talked to regulators. Give me your sense of the temperature around all of that.
Well, sure. I think that with regard to regulators, there is a sense of urgency, certainly, to get things fixed. And regulators are feeling pressure from all sides. From fellow government, what they're seeing is problems with keeping the lights on. There are way too many outages nationwide. There is need to enlarge and expand capacity of the utility industry to be able to handle the flow of energy, particularly in electric, to be able to direct loads to where they need to go as our economy and lifestyle change. Time was 100 years ago when this system was built that you didn't need to send very much power to neighborhoods where people lived because at most they were putting on a few lights, maybe a refrigerator, nothing that absorbed a lot of energy. But now with more and more people working from home, with the advent and spread and growth of the electric car industry, there is a greater and greater need to distribute more energy to residential areas, and then to increase the amount of energy that's going toward factories and businesses and things of that nature. And right now, there's a capacity problem. We've seen, especially over this past summer, a number of brownouts and blackouts due, at least in part, to that. So certainly they're feeling the pressure for needing more energy and trying to figure out where is it coming from and how do we get it to where it needs to go. But then also with increased numbers of storms and the severity of those storms has caused collapses of aging infrastructure and tree and power line conflicts that have really damaged reliability. And there, the regulators are facing incredible pressure. Department of Energy did a study fairly recently in which they estimated that the United States loses, on average, over the last several years, somewhere between 100 and 150 billion dollars with a B each year for lost business revenue that's been insured due to power outages caused by tree and power line conflicts alone. That's massive. It's the size of the GDP of Hungary. It is an enormous amount of lost revenue that also equates to lost tax revenue. So that impedes the government's ability to do what it needs to do. And the problem I think that the regulators are facing is that they're really unsure of where to go next. On the one hand, they want to keep working with the utilities that they regulate, but they see problems that suggest that money isn't being directed where it needs to go. There's new technologies that they really don't have familiarity with. There are all kinds of problems that are shaking their confidence in the industry that they need to rely on to do its work. And this has led to some acrimony. And it's unfortunate but understandable.
Yep. No, I think you raised some really good points there, Larry. And as you were talking about, you mentioned the storms, and certainly very recently, right, we saw what wildfires could do in Hawaii, right? We saw how devastating that is just for the community as a whole. The utilities have some challenges, obviously, along those lines, some major challenges, some of them similar to what we saw with utilities in California with the wildfires. It's just a recent years. And so when you talked about the sort of the economic impact, right? You talked about the over $100 billion. That really goes to everybody from the small business owners up to the major insurers, to the utility companies, and ultimately to the ratepayers who somehow have to, pay some amount, right, for the infrastructure, for the grid. So clearly just a very challenging piece.
Right, exactly. In fact, you could argue that the ratepayers are paying twice, right? On the one hand, they're paying more for the utility service they receive in terms of dollars per kilowatt hour, but then because the vast majority of them are also paying for insurance of their own, they're paying for higher and higher insurance. And so really, in effect, they're paying twice for this problem. And that is making for a very unhappy customer base. And that is something else that the regulators are hearing about too. And that is something that's concerning them, especially in states where the commissioners themselves run for election. In some states, they're appointed, others, they're elected. Certainly, where there's a direct election for commissioners, increasing rates and lower quality service tends to cause these people to lose their jobs. And that's a personal problem for the regulators as well.
That's a very good point. And then, from the utility side, there's a pot of money that the utilities want to make investments for all the things that customers say that they want. And then when these storms come in, all those things that need to happen for restoration compete with the dollars, the capital dollars that they had maybe already approved, to take on things like grid modernization, and just some other things that the regulators and the utilities had come together to agree upon. Can you touch just briefly on just another thing that regulators have, to me, seems like really are interested in? Tell me your perspective in terms of what you've found around the sustainability, right? So one of the challenges is, as you mentioned about the building out of the infrastructure, right? There's more demand on the grid. How to do that in a sustainable way, that's got to be pretty high on their list. And so there's new technology around that too. But what are you hearing from the regulators in terms of how they perceive the ranking of that as a priority and how they view that in terms of a path forward?
Sure. I think that generally speaking, regulators do want to see an evolution toward renewable energy sources as the generation source for energy that can then be distributed widely. The problem, though, that they're seeing is that one, the cost of renewable energy systems to create them is huge and really cannot be accomplished without significant government financing. And while that financing, this administration has been very supportive of and has directed a lot of money toward that. The question is, well, will that be there if there's a change in political parties or not? So that's certainly a question because it's bad enough to feel dependent on federal dollars to make this work. What's worse is being unsure that after you've committed to it and you're halfway through, the money will still be there. And that's very, very concerning when you have an older technology that's not necessarily green that is reliable and it works and it's cheaper. And so there's that temptation to want to rely on the older technology that works, but is not really the way of the future as far as it's being envisioned and being demonstrated useful. There's also problems with very significant failures of renewable energy sources. And this is not to say that it's not working well when it does, but there are lots and lots of, for example, windmills out there that are not being used because they've broken down. They've lost propeller blades. Now, are there better ways to put these things together? Of course there are. And, can these things be restored? Yes. But the problem is you now have a lot of skeletons out there, essentially a boneyard of new technology that is meant to create green energy and is sitting unused because it's broken down. And that's something that regulators have to explain to their constituents. Why is this like this? Why is this there? And what are we going to do about it? And that is not easy for the regulators, who many of whom have no real background in energy or the environment. And so they need to pick this up from staffers who are in turn picking it up from their trusted sources, typically in industry. And again, that's the reason for the creation of the Utility Vegetation Management Institute, is that industry has a tendency, or at least has the perception of being biased. If a candy company, published a study that said that chocolate's good for you, well, I want to believe it with all my heart, but
Right.
should you? Well, maybe it's right, and maybe that was a purchased opinion. And if it was, well, what do you do about that? I mean,
Yeah.
it's something that leaves regulators with that open question.
I think that's fair. And I think there's, certainly California is different from New Jersey, different from Michigan, and they've got environmental differences. They have regulatory body differences. How do you sort of summarize the differences across the regions? Like, can you just give us a summary of what that sort of looks like?
Sure, sure. It's complicated. It's a big country, and so there are a lot of different things to be thinking about when thinking about regionality. So, for example, uh, in California and most of the West, the biggest concern is wildfires. That is far and away the largest concern. The experience in dealing with wildfires has just been devastating, and it weighs on everyone's mind. There are cultural differences, though, between certain parts of the West and certain other parts of the West. For example, California, Oregon, Washington tend to be more liberal, and as a result, they are willing to pass legislation and laws and regulations and policies that will sometimes restrict people's personal property rights while trading that off for greater protection against wildfires. Other parts of the West are more conservative, and in those states, the thought of restricting people's personal property rights is anathema, and they just can't do that. So, what they need to do then is rely on laws and regulations they already have, because people are not in the mood to pass new laws and regulations, especially because they're concerned about how these laws and regulations will be funded. Where's the money going to come from to do these things? And so that's part of the main issue out west. In the Southeast, you're looking at hurricanes as one of the major drivers. It's an area that has been hit with more and more hurricane or tropical force storms over the last several years, and they've become more and more damaging. And what's needed in the Southeast is highly resilient structures, infrastructure that can withstand these kinds of winds and rains and flooding and associated problems, and allow for power to remain on or at least be quickly restored once the storm is passed. And so there you have a much different standard and a harder problem to fix. In the Northeast, you're worried about the occasional hurricane, but you've got nor'easters, you've got heavy winter storms, you've got ice, you've got recently a lot of flooding. And in the Midwest, fewer problems with hurricanes for sure, but especially around the Great Lakes, you're still dealing with a lot of ice load and tornadoes more frequently now. So, what you need to build your infrastructure to what standard, really depends on what kind of environmental factors you're dealing with. Just a couple of days ago at the ISA Texas Trees Conference, I presented a keynote with one of my former students, Jacob Roshman, who's the author of a paper on sag and sway. And what he noted was that in Texas, which originally, when its infrastructure was built, didn't really have to worry about ice storms, but now it's happening much more frequently. And as a result, you have to take into account greater sag and sway than the original design specs. He pointed out in his paper that a regular distribution line stretched, say, 200 feet between two utility poles, if it has just an eighth of an inch of ice on it, that can weigh as much as 500 pounds. And that's enough to stretch the wire without it snapping back. That's a permanent change in the wire itself. And when that happens, you have lower sag and greater sway as the wind blows. And if you were cutting your trees to the standard of the original as built wire, your trees are in the way. And now they're subject to damage, either outages or wildfires, or danger to people who are working in that area, landscapers, line workers, line clearance workers. They're all exposed to now a much greater danger than was previously seen. And these are all things that are weighing very heavily on the regulators' minds. And unfortunately, utilities don't yet have the answers for what to do about this, aside from something really dramatic like, we'll tear it all down and build it again. And that is a very, very expensive and inconvenient solution. That can't really work. You
Agreed.
can't give people the power they need. You can't just say, okay, we're going to take a couple of years off and we're just going to shut everything down and do your best without electricity. That doesn't work. You can't do that. And
No,
so these are some of the regional problems that are being experienced, and they're different from one to the other. there are different political pressures from one area to another, and it's not all red blue, and it's not all liberal conservative. It's also a matter of where do the resources come from, right? So if you're from a part of the country that doesn't produce coal, well, it's very easy to say, well, I don't need coal, and I'll start moving over to different technologies to produce energy. But if you're in a coal producing state and people's jobs depend on producing coal, well, you're going to, as a regulator, be more sympathetic to the need to maintain coal powered systems to generate energy. And if you're going to migrate away from that, you're going to need an answer to all those constituents who might lose their jobs and their livelihoods and have some economic problems, not only personally, but for entire towns or counties that are wholly dependent on coal. They
Yeah.
need something to substitute as well. And that's a political pressure that's neither blue nor red, it's practical.
Yeah. No, thank you, Larry. I appreciate that summary. And I guess one big takeaway I get from that is it's as different as the environments may be and as different as the regulatory constructs might be in different areas. They do have their own things that they have to worry about. But there's some things you said that seem to be very similar around that, right? And you actually gave me an idea about maybe the next episode. And I think we should talk about, how these more recent environmental changes that we have seen with global warming have really changed or affected the original design of these systems and how utilities could perhaps better manage around that. Larry, we did have a question real quickly asking about whether or not there was integrity management programs or capital dollars that could be passed by Congress or FERC rules that might help utilities to accelerate, their investments or anything like that. I do remember when the tax laws changed a few years ago, that the utilities, it became a big deal for customers. There was the tax base for utilities was lowered. Customers got a pretty good refund almost immediately. However, for the utilities, what that meant was that the dollars that they were holding that they were able to use to help reinvest into the system, those were refunded back to customers. And so then they were challenged with then having to go back and put in requests, to get capital dollars to make those investments. So I sort of remember that dynamic going on a few years ago. Are you aware of any other FERC rules or Senate bills or anything like that that's more broad that will help utilities in general? Aside from, I think, the obvious ones around electric vehicles that you sort of hinted around a little bit earlier. Are you aware of any others?
Well, yes, there are a number of federal grant programs that are currently in process. There's the EPA's recent Solar for All. There's the IRA, which is pouring billions and billions of dollars into infrastructure development, and all of that is meant to benefit the people generally, so that new energy systems can be built and distribute that energy ultimately to customers so that their energy can come from both cleaner sources and be ultimately less expensive. But what you bring up about capitalization, I think raises a really interesting point. Right now, by and large, utilities are forced to do their vegetation management using operating expenses, treating it as a maintenance activity. And most of the time, the utilities will apply for an exemption from that to whether it's on transmission, they'll apply to FERC. If it's distribution, they'll apply to their state regulators. But they're looking to be able to capitalize vegetation management. And I think ultimately it is the right thing to do. I'm currently working on a paper with Pierre Connor, who is the director of the Energy Institute at Tulane's Business School. And the paper that we're working on now is investigating whether or not CapEx funds should be used instead of OpEx funds for vegetation management. I think that the whole reason that it's OpEx right now traces to a mistaken interpretation of GAAP, the generally applied accounting principles. in the handbook for that, it refers to certain things that can never be capitalized. For example, landscaping. Because when you landscape, you're increasing the beauty of your property. And so this is not something that can actually be depreciated because land is increasing in value, not decreasing. And while that makes sense, and while it also stands to reason that most of the time utility companies are hiring essentially landscaping companies to do their utility line clearance, what they're doing is very definitely not landscaping. I think if you were to ask any customer if they're happier with how their trees look after the utility company has done the work or before, they're going to say, they butchered my trees. And that is not improving the value of the land. What's more, when you're landscaping, what you're doing is you're increasing the value of your own land. Utilities, by and large, don't own any of the land that they're doing their tree work on. That work is being done on somebody else's property. So this work is not really being done for beautification purposes. Instead, this is really essentially a structure. This is something that ought to be capitalized. And I think if you were to look at the kinds of things that you capitalize generally, like what are the rules for capitalization, and what are the rules, on the other hand, for operating expenses for maintenance, I think what you would find, if you looked at it fairly, is that more factors favor capitalization rather than operating. And why is this important? It's important because utility companies borrow money all the time for their work, and the work has to be done. And so the question is, do you borrow expensive money or do you borrow cheap money? And capitalization is cheap money because it can be secured against. You have an asset to secure against. And so lenders are happier to give lower rates for capital expenses than they are for operating expenses. You can't secure against the gas that's going into a vehicle, but you can secure against, I don't know, a tower or a pole or a generating plant. And so these kinds of things make capital expenses cheaper. So if the
Yeah,
utilities can do the work anyway, then why not do it with cheaper money rather than more expensive money? And I
that's a
think
good point.
if the cheaper money was used, then ratepayers would benefit because they would be experiencing lesser demands on them for paying rates because the work was being done less expensively. Also, in the book California Burning, the author makes the argument that there was that this difference created a disincentive to do work that was not capitalized, and that was one of the problems that has led to the Western wildfire phenomenon.
Hmm,
And
that's
you know,
interesting.
something to consider is, are we endangering ourselves by not allowing for the capitalization of these kinds of projects?
That's a really interesting point, Larry. And I'll say from my personal experience, so I'll go back to the financing part of that, right? The thing that you mentioned, ratepayers on O&M, they sort of pay for it within that 12-month window, right? Whereas if it's capitalized, there's usually an amortization period of 5, 7, 10 years, you name it. It just depends on the asset, right? And so they do get to spread those costs, over time. And I do think there is a benefit to ratepayers for that. The other thing that came to mind too is on the justification. Some utilities have made the case successfully to their regulatory bodies that trimming the trees is almost akin to, sort of like painting your house or just doing preventative maintenance on your house. It will improve the asset. So in other words, if you keep the trees trimmed around the power lines, those assets can range from 30, 40 years, depending on if we're talking about the poles, the wires, its transformers, et cetera. But certainly we've seen what happens if those trees get into the wires, that those components I just named could be damaged immediately. And then you're looking at replacement. So you're not talking about extending the life of that asset. You're actually talking about replacing that asset, which then becomes more costly. So I think you make some really good points around that. Let's get into, I just want to make sure we have enough time to cover a few other things. But thank you for answering that question. I think you gave us some more insights about what's going on from a regulatory perspective and what other laws or policies could help utilities in terms of those investments. Let's get into the technology. So we've just talked about, we know that vegetation management is why we're here, and we know that we've seen all of the ways that could really disrupt the experience for our customers. By the way, I'll just say briefly as we go into this that when I think about, just for myself personally, I think of myself being a little technically savvy, but when I think about my reliance on just my phone, as well as, just other things to make my life convenient, that has gone up tremendously in the last 5 to 10 years. And we know that customers, quite frankly, our communities see that as well. They want instant information. They want to know what's going on. If there's a power outage, I want to know when it's going to be restored so I can prepare accordingly. Very much so for businesses, right? I don't know if my employees can come in. I'm just trying to plan and manage around that. So the need for information is immediate, right? And so the utilities are still have challenges around how quickly can we get the information, how quickly can we respond to these outages so that we can get our communities back up and going. So can you talk a little bit about the technologies that are available to help manage vegetation as a whole?
Sure, sure. That's something that I think is really, really important for regulators to understand and also for utility companies to understand. Let's start with something though that really doesn't work very well. And that's having a technology available that provides information that you don't use. So, for
Okay.
example, in a very recent wildfire, there was clear video evidence of the utility line being struck by a tree and causing a massive conflagration. So the utility company had the video, it was their video camera, but that video, all that it did was prove that they didn't do the necessary tree work to prevent that fire from happening.
Uh,
That is not good for anything. As a former litigator and as an attorney, my advice is don't invest in technology that's only going to drive more nails in your coffin. That is not helpful
it has to
technology.
be used and implemented. I totally agree.
Yes, yes.
So
If you're
what's so
going
what's out
to,
there, Larry?
sure. So remote sensing technology, I think, has a really, really promising future. And I think that that future is here now. There are many different types of remote sensing, but the main two that are being looked at right now are satellite and LiDAR. And both systems are augmented using artificial intelligence. For listeners who may not be aware, satellites, and we all know what satellites are, but the ability to use satellite imagery, which is not just visual, but it's multispectral. So the satellites are able to pick up a lot of different kinds of information by looking down on Earth. And essentially, there are enough satellites orbiting our planet right now that basically every square foot of ground is being photographed at some point every single day. And so there's information that can be not only taken, but can be compared from today to yesterday, the day before, etc. So you can get change detection. LiDAR is either light or laser, and it is used for the purpose of getting the equivalent of radar or sonar, where you set out a ping and something bounces back. But in the old days, I mean, we've all seen those movies where there's something there, but you don't know what. The advantage of lasers is that every single beam of light is bouncing back at some point. So what you get is a very, very dramatic and complex likeness of what the lasers are bouncing off of, so that you can see individual leaves on trees. It's really fascinating. And what that enables you to do is get an extremely good picture of what's out there. And it provides depth as well. And it's the kind of thing that will work in all different kinds of weather. And but I mean, assuming you can do your flyover, that the weather isn't so bad that it's preventing that. And these two different technologies have different optimal uses. So LiDAR, for example, is used very heavily in the transmission part of utility companies. And the reason for that is because it gives a very, very clear picture of transmission rights of way. And that's important because under FERC rules, a utility can be penalized up to $1 million per tree per day of violation. That adds up very fast. And utilities, their senior executives are responsible for signing under penalty of perjury that their transmission rights of way are clear as required by FERC rules. And so nobody wants to go to jail. So they're very willing to invest the dollars that it will take to use LiDAR to scan their entire transmission system. However, there's a trade-off. The cost of LiDAR is much higher than satellite, for one. For another, it's really, really good at looking at those transmission rights of way because a lot of it has been cleared out. And because you're dealing with something that's just the fineness of a laser beam, you're getting extraordinarily good resolution. But with that resolution and all of that data comes a cost in terms of time. And the time it takes to process that data, to get it into usable form for the utility, is lengthy. And these are all areas where satellite shows much stronger. Satellite is less expensive to take the information. It's a lot quicker to process. It may not have the fine resolution of the width of a laser beam, but combined with the utilities shape files where they know where their utility infrastructure is already located, that's where satellite can be very, very helpful. And I performed a study over the course of the last year that looks specifically at satellite technology and as processed through artificial intelligence and its usefulness in detecting tree and power line conflicts. And we looked at a few different factors. Some factors looked at the accuracy of the satellite technology itself. Was it giving a correct readout as to where problems existed? And then other factors that looked at, was it prescribing the right methodology to address that issue? And then third, we asked a question that I thought really wound up being the most interesting part of it. So with respect to the question of, was it finding the problems? The answer is yes. More than 90% of the time, the satellite was finding the correct issues. Sometimes even more than 95% of the time. It was especially good with respect to growth that was coming from the sides. There, it was scoring 95% and above. So that I think was really, really helpful. Additionally, the technology, when it was predicting, well, what should you do about this problem? Should you use a bucket truck? Should you use a mechanical means like a giraffe? Or should you be climbing this tree? There, the satellite was looking at topographical information and was saying, well, this area doesn't really lend itself to a bucket truck. The angle is too steep and somebody will get hurt. So this is a tree that needs to be climbed. And again, that kind of information, which helps to make workflow move much faster and more accurately, is extremely helpful. Utility companies might have to pay as much as $400 an hour for a crew to go and do some work. And when that work is maybe an hour or two away from their yard, then you're paying $800 for them to get there. They show up and they've brought a bucket truck and it's not the right topography for a bucket truck. So you're paying
Yeah.
$800 for them to go back, switch to a pickup truck and go out and get their proper gear for climbing. And all of this is a lot of wasted money that comes to the ratepayers' expense and makes for unhappy voters, which hurts regulators as well as the utilities. So anything that can be done faster to help with workflow is extraordinarily important. But we did one more thing in looking at all of this data, and we asked the very, very highly qualified arborists who went out and looked over this area, would you have seen that without the aid of the satellite information? And on average, approximately once per line mile of distribution line, the answer was no. On a standard routine inspection, I would not have seen that. And it's not because of any questions regarding the qualifications of the arborists. These are amongst the best qualified, certified arborists that are available. They would not have seen this. And that's very concerning. Every mile, there was a problem that the satellite found that a human would have missed. Now, this doesn't mean that you use satellites instead of people. You need to use them in combination. But what was also interesting was that was a standard routine inspection
Yeah.
over an area that included approximately 55 linear miles. In one instance, the arborist said, even if we had done a level 3 California style inspection where you're walking along the right of way, you're circling every single tree, probing the roots, gaining elevation to look down, we still wouldn't have seen it because it was an off right of way tree that looked green and healthy from the perspective of the right of way. But from the other side, it was clear it was a dead tree. And this was a tree that was tall enough to hit the line and to have caused an outage or a wildfire. And that, I think, is extremely valuable because we picked up one of those in a 100 square mile area. Now, I can't say statistically that this is representative of the country as a whole. But when you think of how many 100 square mile areas we have, if that's representative at all, one per, it's tremendous what the
But
satellite was
Larry,
able to find
yeah, but
and to
Larry,
replicate.
I think we all would agree that, what you're really saying is that the technology has the ability to really take human error out of it, right? And it's able to gather information, process information, as you mentioned, just much faster than a human can. And let's just talk about it from a safety perspective. There are just some places it is not going to be safe for utility workers to go, not only for inspection, but just even for some of the general maintenance. And so to be able to gather that information remotely, electronically, very quickly, and then being able to, process that to put together work plans for the utilities, I think that in itself is a win. You've talked about the benefits of LiDAR versus satellite. And clearly the message I think takeaway from that is both of those technologies have offered some value. You've talked about how LiDAR has been used in transmission, but I think there's a case that, you just the right application in the right sense. And it sounds like in many cases, the information from satellite is good enough. I did want you to, let's talk a little bit. We've got about 13 minutes left, and there's a couple of things I want to make sure we hit on. One is really the benefits, right? And so we're doing all this, right? And I think you mentioned some of that around saving time and certainly saving some money. But can you talk about it from the customer perspective? And the regulator, obviously, the customer's perspective is the regulator's perspective to some degree, right? So can you just talk about some of those benefits?
Sure, sure. Well, customers are going to be concerned with a number of different things. One, are they going to get their power reliably and safely? And certainly when trees interfere with that, the answer is no. And that's something they desperately need, especially with more and more people running home businesses and needing to operate from their homes. This is a critical factor. And if they're losing their energy on a frequent basis, they're going to become extremely frustrated and extremely upset. And especially as rates seem to climb and climb, they're feeling like they're paying too much and getting too little. And that is a huge problem that can be avoided using remote sensing technology. Without the use of it, utilities are essentially blind and they need to check every single mile of line, every inch of line for tree and power line conflicts. And the reality is there are probably many areas where there simply aren't any trees posing any risk at all. And those are areas that remote sensing can tell the utility, you don't need to send anybody here. There are no trees that are going to interfere with these lines. No, that's not to say don't inspect the lines. You have to inspect the mechanical soundness and that sort of thing. But that's a very different kind of inspection. And typically the people who inspect for that are not the people inspecting for trees. So I think that is something that's going to be a big concern. The other concern is the inconvenience to the customer of having crew after crew after crew show up on their property to get work done because it wasn't done timely, it wasn't found the first time. Now, using remote sensing technology, you can get all of the problem areas identified all at once. And that means you can address them all at once. And that means minimal inconvenience to the customer with respect to any of this work that needs to be done. What's more, it can actually enable a fostering of a better relationship between the utility and the customer when the utility through remote sensing technology finds a problem that is outside of its easement rights or outside of its right of way, and the utility can explain to the customer what the problem is and why it needs to be addressed. And that kind of interaction where there's a sharing of knowledge and a demonstration that the utility is using the best technology out there as opposed to somebody's opinion is really, I think, a good way to build that relationship with the customer and to explain and to work on problems before they become out of control issues.
Yeah, Larry, that last part, a lot of times I think when we think about using the technology, we're thinking about just keeping the trees out of the power lines. And we think about it from, just improved reliability. But we rarely think about it from an opportunity to communicate. I like the way you stated that, the utilities having that information, it's a lot easier, regardless of whether or not they're sending text messages out to customers or customers are calling in or utilities are directing them to a website where they can find information. Having that information is the key. And I think this technology allows them to do that. I've got a question here in the chat that I'd like to answer for everybody. And the question is, AI tools are being applied for analytics of trees that stand outside of the right-of-way, but still within falling range of the power lines or pipeline above ground appurtenances. Can the raw data being churned on by the AI algorithms originate from either LiDAR, satellite imagery? And that's a great lead in. I actually want to share a personal experience. So the short answer is yes. And so I did, in my professional experience, use an artificial intelligence platform to collect information. We use satellite and LiDAR data. We use those as input to the model, and that model was able to do several things for us. One, rather than managed by a cycle trim of, say, average of 5 years, which is basically overpaying for insurance. You're trying to make sure that you get all of the trees addressed within a certain circuit. We were able to use satellite and LiDAR data that we collected to look at it literally from span to span. And so it goes to a point that Larry made earlier about trying to really put your eyes on something only to find out that you might get it right 95% of the time, but it's the 5% you miss that really can cause you the most problems. So we were able to use that technology and better manage it. In fact, we had about 30% improvement in our reliability targets by doing that. So, the one quick question I guess that would come to mind would be, so if that's the case, why aren't all the utilities doing this? And quite frankly, it's new technology. And so if you look at the utility industry as a whole, if you look at the new technology that's come into that space, you see a lot more of that really in more recent years than you have over the last 40 years, right? And in this particular case, there's a lot of questions about how reliable is it, right? How accurate is the data? Larry talked a little bit about the difference between LiDAR and satellite. By the way, there's probably another 1,000 satellites that are scheduled to go up by the end of 2024. And those new satellites will have the technology where they're going to be even more accurate. They're going to close the gap between what they can see and measure and the accuracy compared to LiDAR. But anyway, that the other challenge is when you have new technology, you have to adopt that technology. So there's some investment in people, there's some investment in change management that needs to happen. And folks, want to know, how much do I have to invest in this new technology and how quickly will I see the return? I will share for you that in my personal experience, the return was in less than 12 months because we were able to not spend money on trimming trees that didn't need to be spent. So when I say that, what does that mean? If I had a mile of a circuit, and typically we would just trim that whole mile just to make sure we got it covered. And so what satellite will let you do, in LiDAR, if you have that data, is it'll let you just pinpoint those spans that need to be trimmed. There's some areas where you don't have trees right under the power line. They may go over an area of concrete. I mean, there's just nothing to be done there. And so you can eliminate some of the costs for sending a crew out to trim over a mile, when in fact only half of that circuit needed to be trimmed. So those are some of the challenges around, why utilities have not really adopted it more. And look, in some cases, there's the scrutiny, there's the regulatory scrutiny, there's the scrutiny from third-party interveners in rate cases. And so a lot of utilities want to make sure they got it right. In other words, they want to make sure that they know and they understand the technology, because they're going to have to defend any changes that were made. And I want to segue into this. So how do regulators and utilities sort of work together on this? I've seen where in some cases the utilities have done their due diligence. They've gone to the regulators and said, hey, we've got this new technology. Can you help us out? We want to be able to get maybe, recovery of these dollars within a specific period of time. And here's our preliminary benefit study that showed some improvements and reliabilities. And I think what needs to happen, and in cases that I've seen, whether the regulators were willing to sit down and look at that, they were able to come together and get some benefits. Can you share, Larry, just certainly beyond my experience, what have you seen and what have you heard around utilities and regulators kind of coming together on that?
Well, what I'd say is I wish there was more of it. And that's one of the recommendations coming from the paper that I've drafted. Granted, it's only a pilot study, and we need to do the test, 2 more times to verify the authenticity of it. But assuming that the pilot study is correct, then my recommendation to regulators is start the process now of approving the use of these technologies, because the benefits are clear. One tree, let's take a case out of California. One tree hitting one power line was enough to burn down most of a county, destroy a city, and kill multiple people. The cost in terms of human misery, as well as dollars, is far more than a couple of pennies per ratepayer per year to pay for this new technology at the outset. But like you mentioned, Gary, what you see is after a year, the investment is well worth it, because now you're not sending crews to places they don't need to go. And that costs money too. And if you can avoid doing that through the use of this technology, because it's making the right recommendations for workflow and work analysis, then ultimately you're just looking at a small bump up, the small investment to get the technology on board and start using it and internalizing it before it pays off long run and results in savings for the customers. So I think that that's important. The other thing is that this is a technology that could also theoretically be used by the regulators themselves. Right now, the regulators, the way they're evaluating utilities is based on their SAIDI and safety scores, is based on general customer satisfaction with the way that the utility is providing service. And they're hearing from more and more vocal groups of interveners who are saying, hey, don't give the utility this money. They don't need it. They don't deserve it. They shouldn't have it. And the reason is because of the poor service generally speaking, that these advocacy groups are complaining about. And sometimes it's real, sometimes it's imagined or exaggerated, but it's certainly felt, regardless of what the numbers are actually showing. And so the really troubling thing for regulators is their KPIs are based almost entirely on what the utilities are telling them about themselves. It's a fox watching the henhouse kind of problem. And it's not hard for advocacy groups to point their finger at that and say, hey, what are you doing to independently evaluate whether the utilities that you're regulating are really doing the work they're supposed to be doing? I know of one advocate in the Great Lakes area who's been taking photos all around the state saying, look at this, look at this, look at that. And it's all of the work that was left undone by the vegetation companies, paid for by the utilities. And that should be very, very troubling for the regulators in that state, who have the unfortunate distinction of being among the top 10 for most expensive energy states per kilowatt hour, and the bottom 10 in terms of reliability. That's
Yeah,
a huge problem that state sees.
that is,
And the kind of thing that can correct that and get the regulators on top of the utilities so that they can see, hey, you're not doing the work we're paying for. And
yeah.
you've got to make up for that. But
Larry, we're right at the end here, and I want to make sure we get this out. So first, let me thank all the participants for joining us today. Larry, thank you so much for all your insights. So for all the people on, Larry and I can both be reached on LinkedIn. He is Lawrence Kahn. I am Gary Huntley. If you look us up on LinkedIn, also you will receive an email about this. All those who signed up for this, you'll get an email with a link where you can go back and watch this episode recorded. You'll also be able to see episodes 1 through 5, as I described earlier. So thanks again, Larry. And thanks again to all of the folks who joined us. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Take care.
thanks, Gary. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Same.